Well, good morning. Thank you for coming here this morning. It seems that a lot of us have gone to Leone Meadows for the women's retreat, so thanks for coming by. And I know that we at least have 2 dishes for potluck, so hope we have 3 dishes for potluck, so hope you can stay by for that. Today we are continuing on in our series on Leviticus. Hopefully that's not why everyone fled to Leone Meadows. I know that Leviticus isn't necessarily everyone's favorite book, or perhaps it just might be after we're done with this series, maybe. Last week we looked at the background, how we got to Leviticus. We looked at some of the underlying issues of this nation of Israel that had been slaves in Egypt, had been living in this world that was ordered in such a way where there was oppression and violence and slavery. And now they had been called there in the presence of God at Mount Sinai from being a nation of slaves to becoming a nation of priests. And they were called to reorder their lives and to help reorder the world around them. And today we are looking at part 2 in this series on Leviticus, at the priests, at the rituals, and the consequences. A few years ago, many years ago, I worked a temp job down in Southern California. And I got to know a few of my coworkers, and one day after lunch, I was talking to one of my coworkers about religion, about our religious beliefs. And I told this coworker of mine that I was a Seventh-day Adventist. And she said, "Oh, I know someone else that's a Seventh-day Adventist, and it's been a while, but I remember her telling me that your favorite book as Seventh-day Adventist is Leviticus." I was like, "Whoa, that's a hot take right there. I don't know about that." I as soon as I was shocked to hear that that's the one thing she remembered about Seventh-day Adventists was that our favorite book was Leviticus. I tried to help correct it. I said, "No, we're a Christian church, so we really value the Gospels, the story, the life and teachings of Jesus." But she said, "Well, she said that your favorite book was Leviticus." I said, "Well, it is true that Adventists have done a lot of research when it comes to the book of Leviticus. In fact, some of the leading scholars in the entire world when it comes to this book are Seventh-day Adventists. One of my professors at seminary, Dr. Roy Gain, he actually wrote the NIV commentary for the book of Leviticus, which is a huge deal because they only get the best of the best to write the commentary for the NIV books. But while Adventists have really dug into the minute details of Leviticus, then we've seen that it really helps to unpack and to explain the plan of salvation. And we've seen that there's a lot of connections between the sanctuary, as described in Leviticus, with prophecy, with the book of Revelation. And there's a lot of good and helpful things when you dig into the details of this book. But that's not what this series is. Again, there is a lot of good and helpful and beneficial things when you get digging into the small details of Leviticus. But what we're doing in this 4-part series is looking at the bigger pictures, looking at some of these major themes in this book. Not trying to get weighed down by the small details, but looking at the themes that were very important to the Israelites 5,000 years ago, and finding that they are just as important to us in 2019. We're finding that this book of Leviticus, there is a lot of good, helpful, beneficial things in these themes. There's a lot of gospel things in these themes of this book. And these are themes that still resonate with us 5,000 years later. And so today we are going to dig in to the concept of the priests and the rituals that they were called to perform and the consequences of those rituals and those priestly duties. Last week, we spent a lot of time looking at the sacrifices, the first 5 chapters of the book, and the 5 different types of sacrifices and what they meant. But today, we're going to look at the priests that were charged with making those sacrifices. And we're going to learn that the important truth for us this morning as we look at this section of Leviticus is that the followers of God are representatives of God, even though we are not perfect like God. We see this priesthood coming into existence here in Leviticus, starting with chapter 8, verse 1, which says this: "The Lord said to Moses, 'Bring Aaron and his sons, along with their sacred garments, the anointing oil, the bull for the sin offering, the 2 rams, and the basket of bread made without yeast, and call the entire community of Israel together at the entrance of the tabernacle.'" What we see here is happening is that the priests are being ordained. This whole new group of people are being inaugurated for a new responsibility, for a new set of duties that they are to carry out. There's going to be farmers in Israel. There's going to be bakers in Israel. There's going to be all these different professions, all these different people doing different work. But there's a new group that's coming into existence, and that is the priests. And so here we see at the beginning of Leviticus 8, or the entire chapter rather of Leviticus 8, this inauguration of this new group of people, the priests. And they're going through this ordination ceremony. And we see a significant thing that happens in this ordination ceremony is that they are anointed with oil. And for those of us that are biblical scholars, that have read and are familiar with some of the symbols of the Bible, we know that oil represents God, His presence, His Spirit. And so we see this image of Aaron and his sons, this priesthood being anointed with oil, representing the presence of God. In fact, more than that, the psalmist writes in chapter 133, verses 1 to 2, this: "How wonderful and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters live together in harmony. For harmony is as precious as the anointing oil that was poured over Aaron's head, that ran down his beard and onto the border of his robe." Here we see this vivid imagery of God saying that this oil that represents Him, that represents His presence, is connected to this sense of harmony that these priests are now to be representatives of in the world. But isn't our world today in need of more harmony? Doesn't it seem like everywhere you look, people are just ready to get into a fight, right? At the drop of a hat. On the international, on the worldwide scale, we see, battles taking place almost, immediately. We on the national scale, we see protests from Hong Kong to Iran to the United States. On a church scale, on a denominational scale, we see these arguments of, we shouldn't do this, or we have to do this, we need to change this, we need to add that, and the conflict that comes. Sometimes we see it on the local church level. Thankfully, not this church. We do a really good job at getting along really well, most of the time. We see it at the family level. The pressure and the weight of all these other things weighing down on the family connections, the family relationships, and just the straining that happens and the conflict that arises between parents and children and brothers and sisters and extended family. We need more harmony in this world, in our lives. And here we see a pretty clear picture being painted that God's presence, represented by His oil, dripping down the priests, is reflective of the harmony that God wants to bring to this world. That in a very real sense, priests are called to be representatives of this harmony of heaven. They're to do what they can to bring harmony into the lives of others and into the world itself. We read more about this ordination service, picking up in verse 22 and 23 of Leviticus 8. "Then Moses presented the other ram, which was the ram of ordination. Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the ram's head, and Moses slaughtered it. Then Moses took some of its blood and applied it to the lobe of Aaron's right ear, the thumb of his right hand, and the big toe of his right foot. What? I mean, oil wasn't the only thing that was being used to anoint these priests. It was blood. And it seems a little gross, right? Or a lot gross. Like, I don't even want my own blood on my earlobe or on my hand or on my foot, right? Much less the blood of someone else or another animal. So what is going on here? What is happening with this blood being put on these priests? Well, what we see here, there's a couple different understandings, but scholars seem to have a general consensus that this blood represents the priestly duties, as they are the people that make these sacrifices of the animals that we talked about last week. And so these sacrifices are representative of peace, of wholeness, of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of unity with the divine, of grace and of freedom. And so, because of that, because these priests are the ones that enact these rituals, that offer these sacrifices, this blood is a reminder. Because if you think about it, back then, there was no microphones, there was no PA system, there was no big screens, there was no audio-visual aids. The whole community of Israel had gathered to watch these priests be set apart, be ordained. And so they couldn't really hear everything that was being said. Moses didn't have a bullhorn. So some of these things were kind of like performance art. So that the witnesses, the crowds that had gathered could see that there was something happening. They might not have been able to hear all of the words that were being said, but they saw Moses take blood and put it on their ear and their thumb and their toe. And so in a powerful way, this was a visual reminder that these priests that were these servants of God, these priests that stood and enacted these sacrifices and rituals, that these priests were anointed on their ears with blood as a reminder that, and as a lesson, that everything that they heard, everything that they thought about, everything that they processed was to be focused and centered as a representative of a God of grace and mercy and freedom and salvation. Everything that their hands touched, everything that they did, the works of their hand, the deeds of their lives were to be a reflection of this grace and this mercy and this freedom and this salvation that their God offered. Everywhere they went, every step they took was to be a step, was to be a place, was to go to a place to be a reminder, to be a representative of this grace and this mercy and this forgiveness and this freedom and this salvation that their God offered to everyone. And so while it might seem a little weird, it might seem a little odd, maybe even a barbaric, what we see here is this powerful reminder that as priests, they were called to reflect God's character to the world around them. This ordination service continues. The description continues in verse 34 and 35. And it says, "Everything we have done today was commanded by the Lord in order to purify you, making you right with Him. Now stay at the entrance of the tabernacle day and night for 7 days, and do everything the Lord requires. If you fail to do this, you will die. This is what the Lord has commanded." So we see that this ordination ceremony, this inauguration of the priesthood, wasn't just a splash of oil here and a drop of blood there, and thank you, you can go on your way now. It wasn't even an afternoon program that where a lot of nice music was played and things happened. No, Moses is saying, God is saying through Moses, that this is actually going to take an entire week, that you have to stay there at the tabernacle for 7 days. And again, those of you biblical scholars that are here this morning, you know your ears perk up, your antennas start to fire when you hear that number 7, right? We know that in the Bible, 7 is this number that represents completion. It's a number that represents perfection. And in fact, there's a principle of Bible study that talks about the principle of first mention, because when you hear the number 7, you automatically think to the first time that number was used. And when was that number first used? In creation, right? The 7 days of creation. And this is what we talked about last week, that Leviticus is in this explanation of how these slaves are to reorder or recreate their lives and the world around them. So we see that these priests are called to be ordained. The ceremony is a 7-day process because God is starting to do this new thing. And they are to be used in this new thing of God's, this new way of ordering the world, this recreation of the world. This is what is happening with the priests here. They are called to be a reflection of this new way of living and interacting with God, with each other, and with the surrounding nations. In a way, these priests, God is calling the small group in order to teach the larger group. Because God is calling them, the entire nation of Israel, to be priests. But he says, in order for everyone to understand what it means to reflect my character, I have to start off with a smaller group of you. It's kind of like learning a new board game. This is my job whenever I get together with my family and there's a new board game in existence. What they do is they say, "Oh, Tyler, we got a new game that we want to play. Here, teach us how to play it." So I take it and I open it up. I read the instructions, I understand, I learn how it's supposed to be played, and then I start to tell the rest of the family how to play it. And I watch as their eyes glaze over. So I say, okay, well, here's the basics. We start off by doing this and a little of this, and in fact, let's just start playing. And so after they kind of understand the basics, then we start to play. And then the other questions come, like, okay, well, what do we do at this piece? All right, well, why should we do that? Or what do we do when this happens? And so then I explain, and then I answer that question, and I answer that question. And all of a sudden, as we learn, as we play, as they ask, as they get the questions answered, little by little, they learn how to play the game. And pretty soon, it goes from something that's words that are ethereal, that's philosophical, to something that's concrete. It goes from something that is just kind of boring rules to something that, oh, hey, I understand, and it's pretty fun, actually. And this is what priests are called to do. God is calling this family to start this to inaugurate this priesthood so that they can help God turn the ethereal, the philosophical, the theological into something practical and concrete. This is the call of the priests, to be able to make that transformation from something that's just weird and I don't really get it and my eyes glaze over and I want to take a nap, to, oh, hey, I can do this, I understand, and it's fun and I get it. And what we see here is that this is the call of the priests to do this. And this, in fact, it wasn't just a call to the Old Testament priests. This is what Peter writes to the Christians. In his first letter, chapter 2, verse 9, he says, "But you, Christians, are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, His special people, that you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Peter is saying, yes, the Old Testament, the Israelites, they had their priesthood, but now you as followers of God, everyone who follows God is a priest, because all of you have moved out of darkness into light. All of you have moved from this theoretical understanding that God loves us, that God forgives us, that God saves us. Now you've seen what it means, and it's changed your life. You now have moved from darkness to light, and because you understand, because it's made a difference, a practical, a concrete difference in your life, now you are called to bring others out of darkness into light. Because you are followers of God, because you have had this experience, now you can help others. Because you understand the rules of the game, you can help explain the game to others so that they can start playing and they can start seeing how fun it really is, what a blessing it is to follow God. See, the followers of God are representatives of God, even though we are not perfect like God. When we follow God, we are accepting a call to represent Him to the world around us, even though we fall short from time to time. See, what priests understand is that it is difficult to represent God because we exist in the in-between. Priests have to deal with a tension in their lives, a tension between what is versus what could be. There's a tension that priests have to live with when they deal with people, because they have to see people as they are, but also as they could be. Any teacher or coach or boss understands this tension. When they work with their students, when they work with these athletes, when they work with these employees that don't perhaps do everything like they should. And so, maybe a teacher wants to say, "What's wrong with you? 1 + 1 is 2. Why don't you get it? I understand it. Why can't you? It's a simple concept, right?" The coach says, "Oh, why can't you hit at the free throw? It's 15 feet away. Just shoot it. No one's trying to block you. It's easy. Do it. I can do it. Why can't you?" Right? The boss says, "Oh, what's wrong? Why can't you fill out this TPS report correctly? What's wrong? Why can't you do it?" And so they see what should be versus what is happening, and yet they live in that tension. Instead of getting upset, though, good bosses, good coaches, good teachers realize that, yes, they might not be doing what they as well as they could be, but with some hard work, with more practice, with studying, with applying themselves, they can be so much better. And so it's that process of living in that tension. It can be very frustrating, but this is what we are called to be as having a priestly presence in this world. We see how messed up this world can be, but we know how good it can be. We live in this tension, and so priests are called to intentionally help create these holy spaces. We are called to help create this bridge between what is and what couldn't be. We are called to create this space of peace, of justice, of forgiveness, of grace. We are called to help create this space of salvation, and so other people can come and experience that space, that holy space, and then in turn share that with someone else. And then they share it with someone else. And then all of a sudden, this small group that has been called to change the world, this small group starts to get bigger. And they start to get bigger. And pretty soon, this small group that started off has impacted the way the world is ordered. This is what we see happening with the priests. They are reordering the world through these acts of ritual that create these sacred and holy spaces. Chapter 9 is filled with these detailed rituals that the priests are called to do, the sacrifices and other things. And we pick this up in chapter 9, verse 22 and 23. It says, "Then after presenting the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the peace offering, he stepped down from the altar. Then Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle, and when they came back out, they blessed the people again, and the glory of the Lord appeared to the whole community." We start to see that these rituals were being effective in that God's glory started to shine and appear to everyone. But it doesn't stop there. Verse 24 says, "Fire blazed forth from the Lord's presence and consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. When the people saw this, they shouted with joy and fell face down on the ground." These priests had done what they were called to do. They performed these rituals as God wanted them to do. And then the fire flashed forth. Then there became an evident connection, an obvious connection, a clear connection between the human and the divine. And the people responded by shouting with what? With fear? With anger? No, with joy, right? They see this fire. They see that a connection has been made, and they are filled with joy. They fall down because there's a yes, this is amazing. God is on our side. God is with us. God is not against us. God wants to draw near to us. God invites us to draw near to Him. This is an amazing thing. This is not the way the world used to work. This wasn't how the gods of Egypt operated. This is something new. This is mind-blowing. And it filled them with joy to see this connection being made. But what we see here is the truth that every detail matters. Because the priests needed to do these rituals properly. They couldn't just say, "Man, I don't know. God wants me to sacrifice a goat, but I'm gonna put up a dog instead." You know? Like, "Oh, God says I should sacrifice a bull. How about I put a camel on the altar?" You know, this is not what happens. Every detail matters. These details, the priests they were told what they needed to wear. They were told, the very minute things of how they needed to operate. And when they did these things as God wanted them to do, we see the results, the good results, the results that brought joy at this connection. Because every detail matters. It's kind of like one of those total makeover shows. Any of you watch those? Oh, come on. I know some of you do. Even though you might be too embarrassed to admit it. But at least you know how they operate, maybe. They'll find a slob, right? That's sitting at home, just eating junk food. Their house is in disrepair. It's dirty. Things are broken. And then they take that person and they whisk them away for a week or so. And they give them some basic nutrition advice. They bring them to the gym and teach them how to use some of the exercise equipment. They take them clothes shopping and remove and exchange their sweatpants and sweatshirt for some nice jeans and a collared shirt, or a nice dress and some shoes, right? They take them to a salon and they get a new hairdo done, right? New hairstyle. Some makeup tips. These things happen, and so the person starts to change. And then, meanwhile, back home, people have come in and they've taken out all the trash and all the rubbish, and they're making the repairs, and maybe they replace the old appliances with some nice new stainless steel refrigerators and stoves in their kitchen. And so then the day comes where the big reveal happens, and the person comes and they're looking they're looking better, they're looking nicer, and they're feeling better, and they go and see their house that's been painted and cleaned and repaired, and all of a sudden, this is a major change, right? And it fascinates us, and it kind of excites us and entertains us to see such a major change taking place in this person's life. But in reality, it's not one major change. This change happens because a lot of the details of their lives have been elevated, right? They take their clothes and make them a little better. They take their food and make it a little healthier. They take their time and instead of spending 8 hours watching Netflix, they go to the gym for 1 or 2 of those hours. They take their home and make it cleaner. They repaint it, they replace, they fix it. And all of a sudden, all of these little details of life have been elevated to the point where there's a massive change taking place. And this is what God is saying through these details in Leviticus, that while we might think, it's just a little color of his robe, what difference does that make? What difference does this make or that make? What God is saying, these details matter. Every detail matters because they add up to this big change. When these details of life are elevated, suddenly life itself is reordered in a way that better reflects God and his character. It would be like asking LeBron James, the star forward for the Los Angeles Lakers, where do you get your socks? And him responding, I don't know. My wife goes to Target and brings home a value pack every once in a while. Or, the equipment trainer, he drops off a pair in everyone's locker and I just put them on. If you responded like that, you would think, what? There's no way. He's just joking, because LeBron James reportedly spends $1 million a year on his body, trying to keep himself in peak physical condition, to the top of his game. And that's why he's become one of the best basketball players in the history of the world, because he cares so much attention to detail. So there is no way that he hasn't analyzed every single brand of sock available. There's no way that he hasn't picked the sock that will help him succeed and perform the best on the court. Because LeBron James knows that details matter. That the details, even the small details, help to elevate his overall performance. These small details make a great change in his life and his abilities. And this is what rituals do. Rituals help us to be intentional about the details of life. Rituals help us to elevate these seemingly small, insignificant details. Rituals help us to understand and to grasp the fact that while the world might be falling apart, things can get better. Think about singing, for example. We sang a few songs already this morning. We'll sing another one before we go. But public singing is a powerful ritual because it gets our breathing patterns synced up with each other. And it gets us to think, perhaps on a subconscious level, but it gets us to think things like, well, if we can do this together, if we can breathe together and make music together, what else can we accomplish if we work together? This is what rituals do. They help us to realize that life, that things can get better. The followers of God are representatives of God, even though we are not perfect like God. We are called to represent him in this world. We are called to pay attention to these details, to these rituals, to help elevate our lives, to help elevate the world, because this is what it means to represent God in a broken and sinful world. And so then we come to the only story in the entire book of Leviticus. Leviticus is just rule after rule after rule, ritual after ritual after ritual, but there is one story. It's a short story, only about 2 verses long, but it's a story that is referred to or is connected with this concept of strange fire. We read it in Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 to 2. It says, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, put coals of fire in their incense burners and sprinkled incense over them. In this way, they disobeyed the Lord by burning before him the wrong kind of fire, or strange fire, as some translations say, different than he had commanded. So fire blazed forth from the Lord's presence and burned them up, and they died there before the Lord. Wow, right? What's happening here? I mean, the last time we saw fire coming from the presence of the Lord, it burned up the sacrifices, and it caused people to fall down with joy, to shout with joy and to fall down, right? But here, fire again comes forth from the Lord's presence, and it burns up Nadab and Abihu. What in the world is happening here? What's going on? Why would God react like this? We think, well, they were just burning some incense, and I mean, they burned it wrong, apparently. But is that really worthy of death? I mean, it's just a little detail. It can't be that serious, right? It can't be. It's not that big of a deal. How in the world was that worthy for Nadab and Abihu to be killed? Well, we've just gone through these 2 chapters that talk about the importance of detail. The importance of getting things right when it comes to elevating these small details of life, because it's not just about these details. It's about the bigger picture. It's about reordering life itself. So I don't think God really was that concerned with the incense, but God was concerned with the fact that these priests that are supposed to be representing him, that are supposed to be the teachers of this new way of life, that these priests were messing up these details that were meant to help reorder the world. I mean, think about that makeover analogy. If the person had gone and gotten a makeover and people had worked on their house but had neglected to remove all the trash, you know, they repainted it and maybe recarpeted it, but they put all the trash back. You'd be like, that's weird, right? To walk in and say, okay, that's a new stove, but there's still a lot of food crust on it, right? Why are there still roaches crawling along the floor of my newly tiled house, right? You need to have all of those details elevated for it to make the impact that it's supposed to make the change that it needs to make. And this is what is happening. Even though we might not think that it's a matter of life or death, it kind of is. It really is. And I think addicts have an understanding of this. Think of someone who struggles with alcoholism, but has been sober for 10 years. They have that 10-year AA chip. And then they go to a work party, and one of their coworkers offers them a drink and says, hey, take it. Just drink it. It's just one drink. Is it really? Of course not. Of course it's not just one drink. This one drink, while it might be okay for another person, this one drink for that person is a matter of life and death. And so we might think, oh, it's just a matter of, it's just a little bit of incense. But we see that when it comes to this reordering of life, it is a matter of life and death. And so when it comes to the story of Nadab and Abihu, we might not fully grasp what happened or why it happened. The scholars say, well, maybe they didn't really care. Maybe they were just trying to do what their dad did and they didn't really pay attention. Maybe they were drunk. Maybe that's why Moses starts to launch in the very next verse, telling priests, don't get drunk. There's these other ideas of the reasoning behind this. But what we do know for sure is that using the fire was something that was only allowable for the high priest, not any of the other priests. And what we do know is that Nadab and Abihu became lax in their responsibilities. They disregarded this distinction. And remember, when it comes to creation is all about distinction, making a separation between the light and the dark, between the land and the sea. And here we see God recreating, making a distinction between the priests and the people, between the high priest and the other priests. And Nadab and Abihu just kind of muddy the waters. And they do what they want to do. And so they pay the price for it. And we might be uncomfortable with that. We might bristle at this automatic death. In fact, people look at this story as skeptics and they say, see, this is why we don't want to follow any of this ridiculous God. He just zaps people for no reason because they lit a little bit of fire and burned some incense wrong. Like, that's just crazy. He's just a mean, big bully. And yet, we are so aware of the consequences of the choices that we make in other areas of life. People might shake their fist at God and say, God, why did you burn Nadab and Abihu? But if someone's goofing off on the top of a high rise and then they fall 30 stories down and die, we don't go, oh, gravity, why did you do that? Right? If someone that doesn't know how to swim jumps off a boat, in the middle of the ocean and drowns, we don't go like, oh, oxygen, how could you do such a thing? Right? We know, we see that there's a connection between choices and consequences. And here, this is what we see, Nadab and Abihu. They made some poor choices, intentional choices, and they had to pay the consequence for it. And so the story continues, and we might think, well, yeah, they messed up, Nadab and Abihu, and so maybe I don't want to be a priest, because it seems like there's a lot of responsibility. I don't want to get zapped by God. But hold on to that thought, because the very next part of this chapter seems to give us a little hope here. See, the priests weren't able to, they didn't just close down shop for the day once Nadab and Abihu got killed. They had to keep going with their duties. And the very next responsibility, they had to offer the sin sacrifice. And the two priests that did, they kind of messed it up. They didn't eat the part like they were supposed to eat. And so Moses gets all upset. Verse 16, Moses asked them, what happened to the goat of the sin offering? When he discovered it had been burned up, he became very angry with Eleazar and Ithamar. These were Aaron's other remaining two sons. Nadab and Abihu were the two that died. Eleazar and Ithamar were the two that survived. And they were the ones that then just blew it with the sin offering. Aaron and Moses says, why didn't you eat the sin offering in the sacred area? He demanded. It's a holy offering. What is wrong with you guys? Didn't you just see what happened to your brothers? They just got zapped to death because they didn't take things seriously. And now you blow it too? What are you doing? But then Aaron answered Moses. And he said, today my sons presented both their sin offering and their burnt offering to the Lord. And yet this tragedy has happened to me. If I had eaten the people's sin offering on such a tragic day as this, would the Lord have been pleased? And when Moses heard this, he was satisfied. Did you get what's happening here? There's a sigh of relief. After these 2 chapters of 8 and 9 of these little minute details, these rituals being emphasized, and chapter 10 starting off with the story of these 2 priests getting killed because they neglected these rituals. All of a sudden, it feels like there's no room to breathe, there's no room for error, there's no room for mistakes, and yet the 2 priests mess up, and Aaron says, man, haven't we been through enough today? And Moses says, yeah, you're right. You're right. And so here we get a chance to breathe. We get a chance to say, oh, wow, this is a human moment. And we see this truth that God understands our humanity. That Nadab and Abihu, they seem to have made an intentional choice to offend God. But Eleazar and Ithamar, they just kind of messed up because they're human. They'd been through a lot. And God said, you know what? I understand. I know you didn't do this on purpose. I know it was a mistake. And it's okay because I get it. I'm a God of grace. And in fact, when we read the New Testament, we read the book of Hebrews, it says that Jesus came as our high priest. And our high priest, he knows who we are. He knows what it means to be human. He knows what it means to deal with the sin of this world and the shortcomings that come with being a human. And so God says, yes, I get it. I understand. Here's my grace to cover you. And here's my grace. Because you are a priest, now you can go and share that grace with someone else. My grace is given to you so that you can be an instrument of grace to others. We see that the followers of God are representatives of God, even though we are not perfect like God. And this is good news. This morning we have found that God's call for the Israelite priests 5,000 years ago wasn't just for them back then. It is for you and me today in 2019. That you and I are called to be a part of this reordering of the world that God is trying to do. That you and I are called to be a priestly presence in this world, to do what we can to create a holy space, a space of grace, a space of forgiveness, of mercy, of justice, of salvation. So that other people can come and experience this space and then go and share that with their friends and their family and their coworkers. So that you and I, as this small group of priests in this world, can make a difference, can begin to change and reorder the world, the entire world, to better reflect God's character of love and mercy and justice and salvation. I want to be a part of what God is doing. I want to be a priest that helps to create these holy spaces. And I hope you do too as well.